Good morning. Welcome to Grand Rounds. As you're finding your seat, if you haven't already, I want to encourage you to sit a little bit more forward. All right, get a front row seat for what's going to be a great Grand Round. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Laura Sienas. Laura is a third-year maternal and fetal medicine fellow here, and she came to us from UC Davis and has excelled in many fronts. One of the things that Laura brought to this fellowship program was her strong interest in advocacy and also in the environment. And so this topic was informed her research, but was also something that she was interested in residency as well. And so we're going to hear a very interesting talk today about endocrine disrupting chemicals. And from talking to Laura briefly, my guess is that everyone in this room is going to make at least one behavioral change, possibly, or might consider it after this talk. All right, and so without any further ado, here is Dr. Sienas.
Thanks, everyone. Okay, so good morning. The topic of my Grand Rounds today is Canaries in the Mind, endocrine disrupting chemicals. I have no disclosure since I'm a fellow. The objectives of this talk are to define endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs, and learn some common examples, to review the impact that EDCs have on women's health topics, and discuss ways that physicians can advocate for their patients and their community. So I got interested in this topic when I read an article in the Gray Journal, which we're going to talk about later, that had to do with a concept called obesogens. By exposing mice to a chemical, the lab was able to change the composition of fat cells in the developing fetal mouse. I started to think about the hundreds of chemicals that we are exposed to every year. As an MFM doing preconception counseling, if I could tell a patient about some of these hazards and possibly impact her future fetus, I thought this could make a large difference. The World Health Organization and the United Nations defines endocrine disruptors as an exogenous substance or mixture that alters the function of the endocrine system and consequently causes adverse health effects in an intact organism, its progeny, or subpopulations. As we know, adverse health trends are on the rise in the United States over the past 25 years. For example, preterm birth has increased from 94 to 119 per 1,000 births. Gastroschisis is becoming more prevalent, I'm looking at you, Yakima, and childhood cancer and obesity are on the rise. Life expectancy and age of puberty are decreasing. All these changes can't be explained by genetics alone, which shows change over time at a slower pace. At the same time, US chemical production and importation is on the rise. In 2012, 9.5 trillion pounds of industrial chemicals were manufactured in or imported into the United States, equivalent to more than 30,000 pounds for every American. 83,000 chemicals are listed by the EPA, which with around 700 of those chemicals being introduced each year. 3,000 of these chemicals are considered high volume or exceed 1 million pounds per year. And of those, only 200 are fully tested for toxicity. Therefore, most chemicals are not fully tested for effects for humans prior to general consumption. Studies show that at least 800 chemicals interfere with hormone receptors, synthesis, or conversion. Virtually all pregnant women in the United States have detectable levels of chemicals such as lead, mercury, toluene, perchlorate, BPA, and others. Many of these chemicals in pregnant women are at levels associated with adverse health outcomes in human studies. So if there's all these chemicals in the environment and they have been shown to cause harm and are found in detectable levels in our patients, I wondered if our governing bodies had anything to say about them. ACOG released a committee opinion in 2013, which was reaffirmed in 2018 regarding toxic environmental agents. They stated that the preconception and prenatal exposure to toxic environmental agents can have a profound and lasting effect on reproductive health across the life course. These disproportionately affect vulnerable and underserved populations. In the United States, minority populations are more likely to live in counties with the highest level of outdoor air pollution or to be exposed to a variety of indoor pollutants, including lead, allergens, and pesticides. Reproductive care providers can be effective in preventing prenatal exposure to environmental threats to health because we are uniquely poised to intervene. Because data is lacking on the safety of most of these chemicals, careful consideration of the risks should be posed. FIGO also released a special opinion bulletin on the same topic, stating poverty and exposures to EDCs are tightly interwoven. There are documented links between prenatal exposures to environmental chemicals and adverse health outcomes that span the life course. Global health and economic burden is in the excess of millions of deaths and billions of dollars every year. And FIGO encourages prevention measures that support broad-based policy change in exposure to toxic environmental chemicals. So why don't we talk about environmental health? We might be saying the research lacking, we're not really that comfortable talking about it. Historically, there was very little data on this topic to begin with, and we all know we have many other important things to discuss during our visits. We might take this ostrich approach where we're hiding our heads in the sand until we can give a full and complete answer or to be able to solve the problem for a patient. We might be unaware that there even is a problem, or you might think you actually are talking about environmental health when you talk about things like blood sugar or hypertension, and we just haven't really defined that. EDCs come from many sources that we encounter in our daily lives, from metals to industrial chemicals, personal care products, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, pharmaceutical drugs, and air and water pollutants. EDCs can work in a variety of ways. As we know with a normal hormonal response, the hormone engages with the receptor, causing a cell-mediated response. EDCs can either block that receptor, causing no further cell action. By weakly binding to the receptor, the EDC can cause a decrease in cellular action, or by binding to a receptor when it's supposed to not be activated, additional cell actions can occur. We know that EDCs can work at low concentrations, many in the range that we are exposed to every day. Through this dynamic system, EDCs can mimic and permanently distort pathways. Evolutionarily, our genes are able to be modified to interact with our environment. For example, elevated maternal cholesterol, which indicates adequate food sources, would cause a developing fetus to create more fat cells. Exploiting that same process and creating inaccurate signals, EDCs can antagonize nuclear responses, interfere with DNA methylation, or cause histone modification to change gene expression in their host. We are all familiar with medications in pregnancy and the process that occurs to have medications enter the market. After the pharmaceutical is developed, it must pass both animal and then human studies before it is released. After post-exposure studies, the grade of safety is released. How do we know about this information about chemicals that are consumed in pregnancy? Is it safe? Minimal to no human testing occurs before a chemical comes to market. After the chemical is released, we can look at post-exposure studies and then create animal studies to analyze risks. As previously mentioned, with over 700 chemicals created each year, we just can't keep up with that demand. UCSF has a program on reproductive health in the environment that developed a methodology to evaluate the science and to grade the recommendations so that we can better understand the research. The navigation guide works through 4 simple steps. The first step is to specify the question being asked. The second is to examine the evidence, both human and animal studies, and then to rate that evidence into known to be toxic, probably toxic, possibly toxic, not classifiable, or probably not toxic, and then to grade the strength of the recommendation. So for example, chemical X is known to be toxic to reproductive health. Doing X, Y, or Z to prevent exposure is strongly recommended. Doing A, B, or C is discretionary. Environmental data is not the usual robust scientific evidence that we are used to guide our clinical decision-making. Randomized control trials are usually unethical. There is good correlation between developmental and reproductive animal studies and human studies. Studies have concluded humans are equally sensitive or more sensitive to chemicals studied in animal models. Given animals' shorter lifespan, carcinogenic studies can take 2 years in animals, where it would take over 20 years in humans. Observational human studies provide the most direct evidence on a chemical's effect on human exposure. It is important to remember both the individual effect versus the population. For example, while a small increase in lead exposure leads to a 2-point loss in IQ for an individual, overall in the population that would lead to 23 million IQ points lost, which is more than any other disease-specific risk of decreasing IQ. There are many different parts of health that EDCs can affect, from the reproductive system to thyroid function, gene expression to neurodevelopmental outcomes, metabolism and obesity, cancer risks, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and birth defects. We all know there are critical times of development in utero, early infancy, adolescence, where these chemicals can have an even more lasting effect. So now that we have this background, let's go through some examples of chemicals that we do know are EDCs and pathways in which they interact. OB/GYN was actually the first test case for all EDC interactions in healthcare. In 1958 to 76, diethylstilbene, DES, was marketed to prevent miscarriage, and 4 to 6 million pregnancies were treated with DES. In 1971, Herbst et al. In the New England Journal discovered a rare gyn malignancy when he reported that 7 of 8 young women exposed to DES had vaginal clear cell carcinoma, the first identifiable EDC. Although it was banned in 1971, it had continued off-label use in the 70s and 80s as a postcoital abortive, as well as an advanced prostate cancer. Manufacturing stopped in 1997, although it is still used for female canine incontinence today. Through modifying the gene expression that regulates the paramesonephric duct formation, DES can cause uterine anomalies. Other medical associations include clear cell carcinoma, breast cancer, endometriosis, epigenetic gene expression, as well as undescended testes. Grandchildren of DES exposed patients may also have an increased risk of cancer through increased DNA methylation of epigenetic cancer factors. Mercury has contaminated 43% of US lakes and wetlands. Our largest source of mercury is through the fish cycle. Runoff from plants and mines goes into the ocean and then has an exponential concentration as it goes up the food chain. Additional sources are quicksilver from broken thermometers, skin lightening creams, or inhalation of vapors. In Minata Bay, Japan, villagers who subsisted on fish that was from this contaminated bay had children who had an increased rate of cerebral palsy, mental retardation, blindness, and other neurological conditions and congenital anomalies. 5 to 8% of pregnant women have mercury levels above the recommended values. Correlation of fetal levels are higher than maternal levels. Associated adverse medical issues include lower IQ, poor language and motor development, ataxia, seizures, hearing, and vision loss. 1% of childbearing women in the United States have a blood lead level of over 5 grams per deciliter, higher than the recommendation by the EPA. Sources include recent immigration to the United States, PICA, occupational exposure, cultural traditional remedies, imported cosmetics, lead glazed pottery, and renovating homes built before 1970. Attempts to decrease lead have been successful. For example, in the graph in the bottom, prior to 1973, lead was in gasoline. With this ban, there was a direct correlation with decreasing blood lead levels in children. In 2019, the Seattle Times reported that 53% of schools in South Seattle registered lead levels above what the district considered an acceptable level of exposure, while in North Seattle, 36% of schools had elevated lead levels. Pregnancy can exacerbate toxic lead levels when combined with hypocalcemia. This is because lead takes the place of calcium binding sites in the bone, and bone is mobilized during pregnancy, which then increases the risk of circulating lead in the bloodstream. Medical associations include less than 10 grams per deciliter, impaired fetal growth, and child neurodevelopment. At levels greater than 10 grams per deciliter, there have been associations with gestational hypertension, preterm delivery, and low birth weight. At levels greater than 30 grams per deciliter, there are associated birth defects, spontaneous abortions, and placenta previa. We have all heard this BPA-free advertisements, but what does that really mean? BPA is a synthetic estrogen that was created in the same lab as DES and used as a strengthener in polycarbonate plastics and epoxy resins. In this picture, you can see the similarities in chemical structure to estradiol. We are exposed to BPA through hard polycarbonate plastics, canned food linings, and cash register receipts. In a study of over 3,000 people tested for BPA, 92% had detectable blood levels. BPA levels are higher in females over males and higher in children over adults. In a study published this week in The Lancet, BPA levels were previously measured through indirect evaluation of urinary metabolites. By now directly measuring BPA in the blood, researchers are finding that blood levels are over 20 times higher than previously reported. BPA has been associated with recurrent miscarriage, hyperactivity in female children, prostate cancer, early puberty, breast cancer, obesity, and decreased semen quality. BPA is banned in 7 industrialized countries, including France and Canada. Here in the United States, 13 states plus Washington, D.C. have limitations on BPA use. More than 1 billion pounds of pesticides are used in the United States annually. Sources include food ingestion, inhalation and dermal absorption of pesticides that are used in the home and garden, and occupational exposure. Multiple types occur, including for insects, weeds, rodents, and fungus. In a study at Sienas Valley, concentrations of pesticide metabolites in pregnant women were evaluated, many that had urine levels comparable with the general population. They found an association with lower IQ and neurodevelopmental test performance. Medical associations with pesticides include childhood leukemia, IUGR, low birth weight, congenital anomalies, and altered semen quality. Most of these medical associations are with farm workers, and there seems to be less data with eating contaminated food. A specific pesticide used is atrazine, which is used on both corn crops and golf courses and contaminates drinking waters. Atrazine is an aromatase inducer, enhancing the conversion of testosterone to estradiol. Exposed to atrazine, male frogs develop multiple ovaries instead of testes. This chemical was banned from the EU in 2003, but still has widespread use in the United States. Additional medical associations include breast tumors, delayed puberty, and prostate inflammation. Polychlorinated biphenyls was a substance that was used as an industrial insulator and lubricant that has been banned since the 1970s. Given its lipophilic properties, it is still present in aquatic and terrestrial food chains today. It is still detected in 100% of pregnant women and detected in cord blood, but at lower concentrations than maternal serum. When exposed to PCB, turtle eggs can be changed from male to female. Additional medical associations include obesity, ADHD, and reduced IQ. PFOA is a component of the byproduct of Teflon. It is also found in carpets, stain resistance, dust, and cooking utensils. Although it's starting to phase out, we still have long effects given the length of time in the environment, as well as the high mobility to leach into other areas. The EPA now has issued a health advisory with the recommended level of PFOA in a person's lifetime. Although many researchers think this recommendation is not sufficiently protective, given its effects to cause endocrine disruption at the lowest detectable levels. Medical associations include renal and testicular cancer, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, reduced birth weight, gestational diabetes, pregnancy-induced hypertension, and a decreased antibody response. 90% of human dioxin exposure comes from our food, as dioxin is lipophilic and is stored in animal fats. Other sources include air pollution from incinerating animals and garbage, and was noted to be a contaminant in Agent Orange. The chemical has a long half-life, and attempts to limit it are improving, but continued exposure occurs given backyard burning of trash. The U.S. Toxicity Program classified this as a known carcinogen. Medical associations include neurobehavioral effects, endometriosis, thyroid dysfunction, and cancer. Phthalates are found in plasticizers and personal care products, flexible plastics, and polyvinyl chloride tubing. Given that they're lipophilic and are not bound to those plastics, they can easily leach. Medical associations include reduced anogenital distance, shortened gestational age, impaired neurodevelopment in females, and asthma. Polybromated diphenyl ethers was a flame retardant that was added to furniture, textiles, carpeting, electronics, and plastics. The California Technical Bulletin in 1975 required foam products to meet an open flame test that reduced flammability, and those standards became known nationwide. Flame retardants were often added to products to meet this test. In 2014, this technical bulletin was updated to include smolder resistance of cover fabrics. The highest risk exposed populations are firefighters, occupational workers, and children. Medical associations include undescended testes, thyroid dysfunction, impaired neurodevelopmental outcomes, preterm delivery, and stillbirth. So now that we've talked about the most well-known examples of EDCs, let's talk about some common women's health issues and what we know about their contribution to these issues. Although there are many studies regarding a whole variety of health topics, I decided to cover a few relevant OB and then GYN topics, and then finish with the general health issue. So in just the beginning stages of ovulation and early pregnancy, studies have been conducted at every step that show interference from EDCs. Given that many EDCs are estrogenic effects, the ovulation cycle can be disrupted at all points. BPA has been implicated in implantation failure. A prospective cohort of 137 women undergoing IVF measured BPA levels. Even after adjusting for age and day of embryo transfer, increasing BPA levels increased the risk of failure. The highest quartile of exposure had 2 times more likely implantation failure compared to the first quartile. Since BPA is estrogenic, this accelerates the rate of blastocyst development, thus leading to this mismatch in timing with the appropriate uterine receptivity window. Higher urinary BPA was associated with a decreased peak serum E2 level, as well as decreased number of eggs retrieved. So why do so many 18-year-olds from Yakima have gastroschisis anyways? Sarah Waller here at the University of Washington used birth certificate data as well as the United States Geological Survey data on surface water to create a retrospective case control study evaluating agricultural exposure and gastroschisis. High atrazine levels were associated with gastroschisis. Also noted that the highest rates of gastroschisis occurred when there was an April conception. That happens to be the highest month of rain for the state, as well as the highest use of atrazine in the state. The LIFE study looked at 501 couples attempting conception and analyzed 258 of those couples after excluding for pre-existing diabetes and hypertension, and then that those patients did get pregnant. Multiple linear regression models were created to assess the risk of gestational diabetes from endocrine disrupting chemicals. In the study, model A, the middle column, adjusted for lipids, while model B adjusted for lipids, age, BMI, race, smoking, and other chemicals. Both models found that PBDE was associated with an increased risk of gestational diabetes. In a prospective cohort study of about 1,000 women who delivered very preterm, less than 35 weeks, were more likely to have hair mercury levels at or above the 90th percentile than were women who were delivered at term. Although this study sample was relatively large, the number of women who ended up delivering prior to 35 weeks was small, with only 44 women, which likely led to a very large confidence interval. More studies are needed to test this association. Other studies tried to link EDCs with similar results, such as my own thesis on phthalates, which I think leads to the fact that preterm delivery is a complicated problem that likely has many sources that are interacting at the same time. Similarly, when looking at low birth weight, many studies have linked multiple EDCs with low birth weight. As we discussed before, EDCs disproportionately affect the poor and underserved, who likely have other risk factors such as poor nutrition. In a study of PCB looking at birth certificate data, as well as zip code PCB levels, it did show an increased risk but had other multiple components, speaking to the multifactorial influences on birth weight. The navigation guide from UCSF that we discussed earlier has done an analysis on PFOAs and have concluded that it is known to be toxic on fetal growth. N-methyl-2-pylordine, which is a solvent that is increasingly used in a variety of industries, including petroleum refining, microelectronics, pesticide formation. Animal studies repeatedly show pre- and post-implantation loss, stillbirth, and low birth weight. There was a case report of a fetus developing IUGR and then a subsequent intrauterine fetal demise at 31 weeks, had a potential identifiable cause given repeated exposure to NMP, as this patient had worked in a lab and had cleaned up multiple NMP spills at 18 weeks of gestation. In Italy, any intrauterine fetal demise greater than 25 weeks gestation or any SIDS case less than a year without a cause must have an autopsy, and then the heart and brain go to a research lab. This study examined brain tissue and common pesticides in the area and found concentrations of the chemicals in 8 cases of intrauterine fetal demise and 3 cases of SIDS. 2 of the compounds found in these tissues were banned in the 1980s and were still present in 2016. Okay, switching a little bit to gynecology. We have learned that many EDCs can affect the stages of puberty. In Puerto Rico in the 1980s, they were noticing increasing numbers of toddlers presenting with Tanner stage 2 of breast development or greater. One component when studied was elevated phthalate levels in these children, which did increase the estrogen to androgen ratio. With pesticides such as DDE, early menarche has been identified. When patients ate fish from the Great Lakes that had high concentrations of DDE, there was a 1-year reduction in the age of menarche for every 15 milligrams per liter of DDE in the bloodstream. Similarly, in a study of Chinese textile workers, increasing levels of DDT decreased the rate of menarche by 0.2 years. One proposed mechanism was suggested after studying immigrating children from high EDC areas. Changes in puberty may come from acceleration of the maturation of the hypothalamus, causing increased GnRH production. The studies regarding dioxin and endometriosis are mixed. In non-human primates such as rhesus monkeys, exposure to dioxin can cause increased rates of stage 4 endometriosis by laparoscopy. A chemical accident in Italy that produced high levels of dioxin in the soil showed no association with endometriosis. In the Nurses' Health Study 2, daughters that were exposed to DES had an 80% increased risk of endometriosis. DES has a proposed second hit hypothesis. In utero exposure causes organizational effects that increase the susceptibility for endometriosis, well then EDC irregularities as an adult are required for disease onset. The first studies of EDCs and fibroids occurred in the Baltic Sea gray seal, up there on the left, which have a large fibroid burden and have increased levels when they have increased PCB rates. Ecker-Ats are exposed to DES and were shown to have a tumor suppressor gene defect in adulthood that increased the risk of developing fibroids. This only occurred when the DES exposure occurred during certain days of gestation. The authors concluded that likely tissues are most vulnerable to EDCs when they're supposed to be in an estrogen naive state. In humans, this is correlated as well. In a study of almost 1,200 women, DES exposure had an odds ratio of 2.4 for uterine fibroid presence by ultrasound. Multiple endocrine disrupting chemicals have been linked with the decreasing age of menopause. 31,000 women were analyzed in this study. The highest observed levels of EDCs were evaluated for their association with age of menopause, and PCB, pesticides, dioxin, and phthalates were all significant. This is thought to be caused by either slow damage to the follicular pool, increased follicular recruitment monthly that leads to overall a decreased pool, or possibly in utero exposure that leads to failure to create the maximum oocyte pool. In women that took DES, there is a relative risk increase of 1.33 to 1.4 of developing breast cancer. Women exposed in utero have a relative risk of 1.18 to 3.96 of developing cancer. Since we know that BPA is structurally similar to DES, this has the potential to affect breast cancer as well. Perinatal exposure alters the mammary gland development in mice, and there's also an increased risk of carcinoma in situ in mammary glands in rats. This is likely through the EZH2 gene, which is an epigenetic cancer marker which alters DNA repair and can lead to more aggressive cancers. Researchers took MCF7 cells, which is a well-differentiated breast cancer cell line, to evaluate the effects of DES and BPA on human mammary tissues. On the left side, exposure to BPA and DES showed an increased EZH2 mRNA and protein expression. DES increases the mRNA that this gene produces, as well as BPA appears to be helping to prevent the breakdown of this gene. EZH2, the histone H3, on the right also increases as a result of exposure to either DES or BPA. We know that obesity is an epidemic in the United States. 17% of children are obese and 32% are overweight. Adipose tissue is modulated by the endocrine system. Leptin is the regulator of fat cell development, and the hormone receptor on fat cells is called PPAR gamma. EDCs have been implicated in multiple pathways that lead to obesity, through adipogenesis, increasing energy storage in fat tissues, and interfering with the neuroendocrine control of appetite and satiety. In mice exposed to TBT, a biocide used in shipmaking that binds to PPAR gamma, in utero exposure increased the propensity of mice to make fat cells at the expense of bone growth, and these mice pups had increased adiposity at 10 weeks. As an adolescent mouse, exposure leads to weight gain, insulin resistance, increased leptin, and a fatty liver. These effects were seen through the F3 generation of these mice. Other EDCs have been linked to obesity, but mechanisms are not all as clear. Potential obesogens are altering metabolic set points. If this is true, the implications would be profound. The higher number of fat cells from the beginning of life cannot be reduced by diet, exercise, or even surgery. Interestingly, smoking, which we think about causing fetal growth restriction, can increase the risk of adulthood obesity by 50 to 64%. There appears to be a spiral effect of obesogens. Since obesogens are lipophilic, they recruit higher fat levels, which then increases the retention of lipophilic pollutants, and then bioaccumulation occurs, continuing this cycle and creating more problems. So now that we have all this information and we have some EDC examples, and we can see that they're affecting our patients' health, what are we going to do? So PIGO has some goals for physicians, including advocating for policies, ensuring a healthy food system, incorporating environmental health into your practice, and championing environmental justice. ACOG has just a few simple tasks to us from their committee opinion. They want us to learn about toxic environmental agents in their community, educate patients how to avoid them, take environmental exposure histories during preconception and first prenatal visits, report identified environmental hazards to appropriate agencies, encourage patients who are pregnant and breastfeeding and women in the preconception period to eat carefully and watch mercury levels, to advocate for policies and practices that support a healthy food system, and to advocate for government policy changes to identify and reduce exposure. We all know that there's not even enough time at an initial prenatal visit to review your history, establish dating, and now I'm telling you to also add counseling regarding environmental health. So I have a few simple resources that we can all try to use to give to patients to try to help make this counseling a little bit easier. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Dirty Dozen from the Environmental Working Group. I don't think it's realistic that all of our patients can eat organic all of the time, but we should try to recommend to try and focus on these 12 fruits and vegetables, which have the highest risks of contamination. In 2014, it was noted that one pesticide was found on 3/4 of all the samples analyzed by the USDA. This list of 12 things are the highest pesticide concentrations of fruits and vegetables, even if you're doing normal washing. More than 90% of samples of strawberries, apples, cherries, spinach, nectarine, and kale tested positive for residue of at least 2 or more pesticides. Multiple samples of kale, which we think of as this great health food, have over 18 different pesticides. Kale and spinach samples in general have 1.8 times as much pesticides residue by weight than any other crop in the United States. So eat organic kale. Yes, Suchi. Uh-huh.
Where did guarantee the like they totally met their standards and they have to
Yeah. The Dirty Dozen tests both non-organic and organic products of these and said that that's why they make that difference, that organic products don't have any residual of the pesticides, If you were to do non-organic and, like, for example, wash your strawberries, you're still going to have at least 2 pesticides on your strawberries. Okay. In 2017, ACOG updated its recommendation on fish intake in pregnancy and broke it down to best choices, good choices, and choices to avoid. This categorized more than 60 fish types. Our initial prenatal packet does have a handout pretty similar to this. It was used as a cautious and highly protective analytical approach, and it incorporated feedback both from public comment as well as an external peer review of the literature while making these recommendations. I also think it's helpful that they have that little serving size of how much you should be having per week. Okay, so when it comes to drinking water, getting a passing grade from the government does not mean that their water is safe. Legal limits for contaminants in tap water have not been updated over 20 years. PFOA, which is what the byproduct of Teflon, is a really high contaminant in the water. The Environmental Working Group has a tap water database that evaluates state water records. So I put in the zip code of the University of Washington, and when evaluating water from this zip code, tap water provided by this water utility was in compliance with the federal health-based drinking water standards. But even under this compliance, there were 6 identifiable contaminants above our health guidelines. The water database also then gives you suggestions for which type of filtration to use to try to decrease your risk of these contaminants. The Environmental Working Group has been working hard both on that dirty dozen for food, but also has an excellent website where you can review and compare over 64,000 products for EDCs. There's also an app called the Healthy Living app that combines the foods and products into one. And so I talk to patients about downloading it on your phone so that when you're at a store, you can be able to look this stuff up quickly. The Pediatric Environmental Health Specialties Units are a network of experts in reproductive and children's environmental health. They specialize in prenatal and childhood exposures to EDCs. There's an active chapter here at the University of Washington. Through their website, you can find fact sheet on common exposures, webinars and seminars for both patients as well as health professionals, as well as contact information to environmental health experts if you have a specific question about an exposure for a patient. The Endocrine Society has recommended future research goals in the next 5 years, including extending mechanistic studies of EDCs on hormone receptors, looking at tissue-specific effects of EDCs, translating research from rodents into non-human primates, sheep, and other species, testing additional critical periods, especially in adolescence, as there's not much research in there, designing studies to consider sex and gender differences in response to EDCs, in humans considering genetic diversity and population differences in exposures and outcomes. And then the goal would be to create something similar to the drugs and lactation manual that we have, looking at guides for environmental exposures in pregnancy. Okay, given our current political climate, we as medical professionals in this community have an obligation to be advocating for our patients' health. The current administration has decreased regulations in over 85 environmental laws and protections since taking office. He has introduced legislation to actually remove the EPA and is currently decreasing funds for healthful food options by decreasing SNAP benefits for people across the country. We need to help advocate for legislation that helps return some of these protections. Currently, each state level is starting to do some of this work, so there's some work here in Washington to start work on more protection of waterways, mostly starting with the orcas, but then also to be able to help us as well. And so we should be looking at those efforts. Okay, so in conclusion, endocrine disrupting chemicals are hundreds or more of exogenous chemicals or mixtures of chemicals that interfere with the aspects of hormone interactions. Many of our patients are exposed to EDCs during critical periods of development, and these can alter their medical outcomes. We as physicians should be working on patient education, advocacy, and future research. I'd like to thank Dr. Jean Connery, who is one of my residency attendings and who is currently the president-elect of FIGO, and her big push is for environmental health, so it should be coming up to the forefront in the next couple of years, as well as Dr. Kelly McHugh, who got me interested in this topic. I'd like to thank my research mentor, Sheila. She's gotten me involved with the PEHSU team here, and so I'm part of that organization. So if you have a patient that has some type of exposure, you can email the group and then we send out references or they'll do a free consult. And then also thank you to my co-fellows for all their support. I'll take any questions. That's my dog. You're welcome. Dr. Hayes.
I'm wondering what other recommendations you have for people who are interested in both decreasing personal exposure, because we were talking at the very beginning, you were saying, oh, I thought I had it all together, and now I'm feeling there are more things I'm thinking about, and then also what else you might be able to do both.
Sure. So I think for your own personal exposure, I think the first time I learned about this, I wanted to like sit in a bubble and make all my food from scratch and eat everything out of glass and never use a product again, which is not really realistic, right? And so I think making small changes in one area is super helpful. So for example, switching out all your Tupperware from plastic to glass. You can get a pack at Costco for pretty cheap, and then that's one way to decrease your risk of phthalate exposure, for example. The Environmental Working Group has a really interesting guide on sunscreen. So like that could be one product that you change because there's a lot of additives of sunscreen that you can change. So I think kind of making small changes over time, I think it's unrealistic to get rid of all of these environmental exposures. We know that we're going to be exposed to some of them, but it's really just about decreasing high rates of exposure. I think for the advocacy piece, I think if you have an idea or something that you're interested in, it's super important to talk to people to be able to help get that legislated. I think right now in our current national system, there is going to be very little movement on environmental protections. And so I think being able to do some statewide protections, a lot of things that have come out of California with protections have actually been starting to move nationwide. So for example, they just did a bill that makes that right now, if you buy a personal care product in the store, they have to have an ingredient list listed so that you can know what it is. But that's actually not the same for chemicals that are found in industry. So for example, like a nail salon, there's no environmental, there's no ingredient list listed any of those. So they created a law so that patients who work in nail salons can figure out even what they're being exposed to, and that's not being able to spread nationwide. And so things like that are little steps that we could be making to be able to help patients. I also think currently this week with the administration increasing work restrictions for SNAP, it's really important that we're contacting both our local senators and representatives as well as nationally to be able to talk about why it's so important to get access to healthful food. We all know our patients need that, and adding additional work restrictions is going to make it really more challenging to be able to buy both just food in general, but then choosing healthful food is more expensive, unfortunately, in this country. And so to be able to give patients that ability to do that. Yeah, there's a pretty big lobby here in this state on the agricultural side to be able to push, especially like restrictions on pesticides and things. In general, we are more friendly on like marine health and water health than many other states, but I would say California is usually like the most friendly and definitely pushes on.
Thank you so much for this talk. And I'm wondering if there's any way, I know your slides can be online, but it'd be really helpful to have a list of those websites that you put up on your slides that you could email out to us or someone could, so that we could just have that handy and hand those to patients.
No problem. I can do that.
That would be so, and I really appreciate your pulling all of this together. It's really helpful.
Thank you.
Do you know if our patient plus or our app?
I asked about the patient book, and it has some information about like fish and mercury, but that's the only thing that it has in there right now. Yeah, totally. I also, when I was at my last institution, had a bunch of dot phrases that I added to the after visit summary, and so with the transition to Epic, we can bring those back as well. Joelle.
I'm just gonna say that, I think it's easy to forget that advocacy is not just what you do in your legislature, but it's what you do in your life. Maybe you go a certain way and you ask questions, share tips, and like over time to go through your life. And you do realize plastics, just so that you will see what's here they are and see what changes based on much of that much. I'm really concerned about these things. One simple thing that it's not just having to prove the plastic. The first thing we can do is prove it up. And everybody, a lot of people do that. Basically, that's what right? That's a small one.
Yeah.
So I'll put it in the right way. And then, just maybe using plastic over time.
Great point. Dr. Giddy?
I agree with that. I frankly think one of the most troubling things about this area is the intersection between income inequality and environmental justice and environmental exposures. And that's a very, very tough line. And I think we have to think about that incredibly carefully, both in terms of our advocacy, but also in terms of what we're recommending to our patients. Like that the Dirty Dozen list, I mean, it's so, it's so incredibly tough and challenging.
Definitely.
So it's just, I know that this audience is very mindful of that, but we want to encourage healthful eating, and is it better to be eating kale that has some pesticides on it?
And no kale at all. Yeah.
Is there any way that we can wash our food so that we can get our pesticides? That's what I want to know. Is like, how do we wash our food better? Is there some recommendation?
There's not. It says what they did was they washed all of those vegetables twice just in cold water, which I think is what most of us would do, and then tested them versus just a single wash of the non-pesticide. Yeah. Please. I'm not sure. Yeah, extra questions. Yeah, Joanne.
So there's not been any consistent study of any special washers. All the studies, the actual scientific well-designed studies coming up through water, it mostly eliminates bacteria, which is helpful, but not so much harmful exposure. You could try buying those washers like grills or whatever, but nobody's really evaluated how much that helps. And obviously, those are technically not toxic, but probably wouldn't just have either technology as well. So maybe there's pros and cons. Water is mineral.
Yeah.
And really good thing.
At least wash in water.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think this sort of subject should be given not once during the 4-year medical school.
Yeah.
So this is out of your minds. Should be updated probably, in my mind, every year.
Yeah.
And so you don't forget it. And so you get to the place you're not quite so scared. Like after we heard that psychologists talk about microaggressions. Microaggressions almost scare me. If I was a teenager, how would I approach the female sex?
Yeah.
Run and hide. This isn't quite so run and hide.
Sure.
But I do think it needs to be repeated.
Yeah. I think it's important. I think even just the updates from the last time I gave this talk till now have been, there's been a lot more literature, even something this week, and so it continues to change. So I think it's important to keep talking about. For sure.
You fill their mind to the overflowing point.
Right.
That's why we need to repeat.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.